Okay, so let's get going on video 3, which is working with color kind of level 2, where we start to get into a little more advanced uses of our color and our shapes. So this is where we start to look at our appearance panel. Okay, so when you are first introduced to Adobe Illustrator, it might appear, based on this little area here, that essentially you can apply a fill color or pattern or gradient or whatever, and a stroke color pattern or gradient. And you might think then, if you wanted to kind of apply multiple things, like say you're like, ooh, I'd like a really thick blue box that goes around the outside. Well, how do I do that? Well, I guess I'm going to have to make a box that goes over top. I'm going to have to put no color in it, and I'm going to have to then make this blue, and I'm just going to use the stroke here. There's a separate stroke palette, but let's say we do it like that. And then I'm going to have to carefully align this shape over top so that it snaps down. And I guess I wanted to see more of that black, so I'm going to change my stroke so that the black goes on the inside of the shape. I'm going to make it a little thicker. Okay, so you might sort of assume that in order to achieve that look, that's what you'd have to do. You'd have to draw two shapes over it. And this is where I haven't talked about it yet, but this is sort of part of the basics, so I'm going to touch on it now, is using your layers. So your default layer, and we can go through and we can see that, because these are primitive shapes, these are all recognized as rectangles. So I've got my red rectangle on the bottom with my black stroke around it, and then I've got, other rectangles, but then I've got this one right there. So these two shapes work together. That's okay, but you don't need to do that. I mean, we want to try and do things as simply as possible, because definitely as you get into doing anything of any complexity in Adobe Illustrator, you're going to have sometimes thousands of these shapes and paths and stuff like that. And keeping them all straight, if you want to change the color or whatever, can get a little daunting. I mean, the layer palette is here to help you navigate your shapes in graphics, but simplicity is always better. And the appearance palette is here to help us do more advanced things with applying our color to our shapes. So I'm just going to delete that color. So what I can do with my core shape, let's say I've got my stroke, but now I can actually add a new stroke. And I can change the attributes of it. I can put it on the outside, and I can change the color of it. I'm going to change it to the blue, and I can make it thicker. Okay, so you can apply. I'm sure there's a limit. There's very few reasons to apply too many of them, but you can apply, multiple strokes to your path shape. And the same also is true of fills. You can stack fills over top of each other, right? So if you're just using solid colors out of the gate, it doesn't seem all that useful, right? Because I'm just going to change it to blue. Well, that just made it blue. What's the point of having this red underneath it in there? And there isn't much. I mean, you could expand the fill and change the opacity of this blue to make a mix of our spot colors. So let's say we set a 50%. So that's going to mix 50% of my spot blue and sort of make a purple. And there's certain cases in silk screening where you actually intentionally want to do that. But most of the time in CMYK output, it's just going to mix those two colors together. Illustrator is going to give you a warning as well, saying the output can't be guaranteed and stuff like that. But as long as you've built your spot colors correctly, which we'll get into in more detail with Pantone color matching in the advanced level 2 stuff. But in this video, I'm just going to focus on how you kind of achieve a certain look. So this is where we can kind of start to do more interesting things with the types of gradients that we have. So instead, let's say I'm wanting to sort of shade this color, but I want to give it a real kind of rounded, glossy upper left-hand area, and then a linear gradient of the blue underneath, right? So how would we achieve that with a combination of swatches and fills? So let's go and I'm just going to make this blue as well. No, I didn't want to do that. I just wanted to select it. And then up here, I'm going to apply my gradient over top of it. So this gradient now is something that I can work with. So this is where the difference between transparency and tint also can apply at when you're building out your gradient. You'll notice that in addition to being able to change the tint of the target, or one color in your gradient, you can also change the opacity of it. So I can blend that down to 0. And I'm going to save that as a new gradient swatch because it's different than my previous one. You can kind of see here that Illustrator is showing the alpha or the transparency by putting this little checkered grid in there, which is kind of a convention that we're familiar with in Photoshop, and it's showing us here as well. So that's letting you know that you're going to 0% opacity. So it's still, it's still going to be blending over top, but Illustrator is going to treat that type of fill differently. And if I put a red underneath this fill goes over top and blends a little more smoothly. It doesn't have that graying effect nearly as much, so you get a much more vibrant blend. It's still going to, it's being realistic about what you're going to get on your paper there, but it is still it looks better, and it does print out better if you want to put a gradient from like a blue to a red. If you build yourself a gradient that goes from 100% to 0 of the same spot color over top of your other spot color, that gives you a nicer looking blend. We can then also in our appearance palette select this particular fill and just change the attributes of it. And you can change the ramp this way, for example. And we can put another gradient over top of it as well. I don't really know what the limit is. I've definitely gotten too complex with some shapes where I've put like 6 or 7 fills and it seems to stop behaving very well. But typically 2 to 3 is really all you kind of need within your shapes, within reason. But this is just purely so that you can kind of get more complex color applications without needing a whole bunch of different rectangles. Like this one shape is carrying all of that. So it's just a little more easy to work with once you get comfortable with it. So I'm going to do another thing. This is a pretty common thing that I'll do when I'm rendering stuff is I just want a white, just a gradient that's white. And I'm going to make this one radial just for the sake of making it radial. And I don't want my 0 in the middle. I actually want the 100%, the bright white in the middle. This is for sort of putting like glossy overlays or highlights on stuff. So there's this little icon, reverse gradient. Sometimes you really got to pay attention to the tooltips in Illustrator because icons aren't necessarily super intuitive. But we're going to just reverse that gradient, and that's going to make the white part in the middle. And I'm just going to save that for myself right there. And now on my shape, I'm going to select my shape again, and I'm going to go and add a new fill. And I'm going to make it that white center one. So you can see that, like, let's grab our shape tool and let's just kind of move it out and make it bigger. Okay, so let's go back to the appearance. Because it's over top of my strokes, it's actually fading that right over top of the stroke. So it's actually applying my gradient to my strokes in a way that I could never achieve by putting a gradient in the stroke fill itself. So that's kind of a nice thing about the appearance palette, is that you can actually drag your fill attributes and stack them up and achieve looks that you just couldn't get any other way. So the appearance palette is really the only way that I'm aware of anyways to kind of include gradients in your strokes if you want to. But let's say I didn't want that. Let's say I wanted this white gradient over top to not affect my strokes. Well, I can just click and drag this down. And now that kind of treats it as that. Or similarly, if I just want it over only the black stroke, then I just pop it between those two strokes. So now whatever I do with this white kind of fill, let's say I want a highlight point up here, it's not going to affect the white, it's just going to affect the black stroke. And I can change my mind on that pretty much all I want. So this just gives you much more flexibility with your fill colors. Although it doesn't look like that applied over top of that blue stroke for some weird reason. This is the other thing you'll learn with Illustrator, is that it isn't always 100% perfect. It doesn't always completely behave the way that you expect it to. And that just to some degree might be just me not knowing something about what I'm doing there, but for the most part I don't see any particular reason why this gradient shouldn't apply over top of that blue stroke. And I'll find sometimes if I delete this stroke and then add a new one underneath, suddenly magically, now let's just try it. Make it blue and put it on the outside. But who knows, there could be a rule that says that strokes on the outside aren't affected by gradients. I don't know. That's what it's looking like to me right now. So, you know, I'm learning stuff about Illustrator every day as well. But anyways, you can get it, kind of, you got to mess around with this to get comfortable with it. But just understanding that you can move the order of things around is kind of the key point of this little demo. So I'm going to just say I want that restrained within the strokes here, and I'm going to just kind of adjust this. I'm going to zoom out a little bit by holding down Control and then hitting the minus key. That's your shortcut for zooming in and out, which you're going to use a lot in Illustrator. And let's just kind of reshape this a little. Something like that, doesn't really matter. I'm not trying to achieve anything specific there. So the other thing to recognize when you just select this shape, whatever the kind of uppermost fill is what the gradient palette's going to default to. The only way you can actually manipulate the specific fills is to highlight them in the kind of attributes stack here, and then you can go through and change those things. So you can kind of understand how I've got those fills, and you can also hide them. So it's like a layering system within the appearance palette. And this applies to patterns and things like that. We'll get into applying patterns and using patterns in other videos. But for the basics of working with your colors and getting a little bit more into the more advanced thing, we are looking at our appearance palette here. There's other things, adding effects. I'll cover that in a different video because it kind of gets into how various filters and effects react to how your colors are set up. But kind of go through that in more detail in the next video, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what this overprint fill and overprint stroke stuff is all about. We'll make that in video number 4, which is working with color level 2 part B.